is the agenda for this evening. And tonight, we're basically, the main purpose of this is the final public stakeholder meeting for the 2021 hazard mitigation plan update. The first stakeholder meeting was held in March of this year. During that meeting, we provided a status of where the update was and got some input on some preliminary mitigation actions that had been identified at the time, and then also solicited input on ideas for additional mitigation actions. So now we're here closer to the finish line. The purpose of tonight's meeting is to really focus on presenting the key findings of the update as part of the final review and comment phase that Elle was just mentioning. I'll start by providing some background information and context just for hazard mitigation planning. Some of you, this might be the first meeting that you participated in, so just wanted to frame it a little bit, and then we'll get into the good stuff, the findings from the actual update. So again, the framing, why is hazard mitigation important? Well, I think most residents in Revere are pretty aware of hazards that the city faces, particularly being a coastal community, the nor'easters that have come through, concerns with sea level rise, inland precipitation, extreme heat. The city is exposed to a lot of natural hazards. As noted here on the slide, the magnitude of the disaster depends on how intense that event is, who all's impacted, and then the effectiveness of pre-disaster mitigation actions that may be in place. And that's what we're really looking at. How can we work to break the cycle of the significant impacts being faced by the city? And hazard mitigation really works. It reduces exposure, helps municipalities save money, protects lives, property. Here's a snapshot from a recent study that was conducted, which estimates that for every dollar that is spent on a federal project, basically there's $6 saved by that investment in the hazard mitigation, basically avoided damages. So mitigation works, it pays dividends. It's worth the effort and investment upfront because you're going to save a lot of money in the long run and result in a more resilient community. So why are we doing the plan? What's triggering it? Why are we here tonight? There's the Disaster Mitigation Act of 2000. This required a state mitigation plan be implemented for states to be eligible for federal funding through FEMA for disasters. And then it also had a requirement for local mitigation plans for different communities to also have a hazard mitigation plan in place. The 2018 state plan, that's the latest state hazard mitigation and climate adaptation plan that was prepared. We really need to crosswalk with that state plan, and we have done that with this update. An interesting and important development through that state plan was really kind of looking at hazard mitigation and climate adaptation. There's really an intersection of those two elements. And so the state plan incorporated climate adaptation considerations into hazard mitigation, and that needs to be done in the city's plan update, which we have done, as you'll see. So just, stepping back in time, kind of some key checkpoints starting out at the beginning of the year. We had our local planning committee. We had that first public stakeholder meeting that I mentioned in March. And then over the last several months, we've been busy doing our work, getting things pulled together, prepared a draft hazard mitigation plan that has been put out for public review and comment, as Elle noted, and we are receiving comments currently right now. After this meeting and after we incorporate the changes, we'll submit it to the Massachusetts Emergency Management Agency, or MEMA, who will ultimately submit it to FEMA for their review and approval on behalf of the city. So we're hoping all that plays out over the next month and a half, and that by the end of this year, we'll have an approved adopted plan in place for the city of Revere. The planning process is very important for these plan updates, and a lot of people have been involved. It can't be done without the community involvement and support. We had a great local hazard mitigation planning team. Elle was at the helm. A few members that Elle identified are participating here tonight, but we had good representation across the city departments, different interest groups. Also, stakeholder engagement is really critical through the planning process. It's really kind of a community-based plan. The city has things that it knows about that it needs to handle, but we also need to hear and understand the concerns of the residents so that that gets factored into the overall plan and considered in the comment process. So this slide just identifies some of the required stakeholders, neighboring communities, some agencies that are involved with hazard mitigation, but also there's a lot of other stakeholders that can be involved. And there's a long list here of examples, and those are stakeholders that we've reached out to, involved, provided drafts of the plan to, and are soliciting feedback from now. So a little bit more background, and then we're getting close to the update. The first plan that the city of Revere put into place was in 2005. The first plan update was conducted in 2015, and that's really been the version of the plan we've been working with for the current update, kind of refreshing it, pulling in the considerations of climate change, getting the new actions, ideas from the city and the stakeholders. And that's kind of what we're presenting here today. And with that, my colleague, Tom Redstone, one of the key members of our team who conducted some of the risk assessment for the plan, he'll provide a summary of some of the findings, and then I'll come back and talk some more about the strategy and actions that were identified as a result. So Tom, over to you.
Thank you, Aaron. So as Al mentioned in her opening remarks, mitigation planning is a critical step towards determining a path forward with mitigation investments and helping build community resilience. And the risk assessment really starts that process. As the Venn diagram on the screen shows, risk is really at the nexus between natural hazards, including the location, the strength of the hazard, past occurrences and future probability, and community assets, which is where the damages really come in, or the effects on people. So the risk assessment highlights the potential for damages created by the interaction of hazards and the community, as shown in the Venn diagram, and it provides a factual basis for activities that are later proposed in the mitigation strategy to reduce the losses from identified hazards. So FEMA requires local risk assessments to provide information such as the location, extent, previous occurrences, and future probability of the natural hazards to prioritize mitigation actions and reduce losses from the hazards that have been identified. So in short, the risk assessment provides a foundation for the community stakeholders and decision makers to evaluate mitigation strategies and actions that are outlined in this strategy. Next slide, please, Aaron. So while the first Revere mitigation plan was completed in 2005, regular updates of the risk assessment are important to ensure that the plan remains applicable to present day risks and vulnerabilities, which do change with time, particularly as development patterns change. And they are critical to ensure that the plan continues to present the best path forward for reducing future damages when those hazards occur. And the important part of from a planning context is that risk assessments promote participation and community buy-in. So that way stakeholders are confident in the plan as well. Next slide, please. So there were several key changes in the 2021 update compared to the 2015 update of the Revere Hazard Mitigation Plan. And two of those changes, those assessments, included the update of the FEMA-defined special flood hazard area, which was updated in 2017, as well as the significant efforts the city has taken for the state-sponsored municipal vulnerability preparedness activities and the summary of findings report. And additional changes included the framing of natural hazards for the context of climate change and the climate change interactions, which will be discussed in future slides, as well as the newly incorporated data from FEMA's National Risk Index was incorporated into each hazard profile where available. And the National Risk Index is a new tool that was released by FEMA within the past year or so. So this really is a new approach. Next slide, please. So while the hazards profiled in the 2021 plan are not all that different from the 2015 plan, the framing of the hazards is different. As previously mentioned, the hazards were framed through the context of climate change and climate change interaction. And this was in alignment with the 2018 Massachusetts State Hazard Mitigation and Climate Adaptation Plan. So there are 4 primary climate change interactions in addition to non-climate influence hazards. So the climate change interactions include changes in precipitation, sea level rise, rising temperatures, and extreme weather. And there are individual hazards profiled under each climate change interaction. So precipitation affects inland flooding, drought, and landslides. Now, those hazards under changes in precipitation have not changed too much, or their classification has not changed significantly since the 2015 plan. So much of that information was simply carried over and reorganized. Sea level rise does affect coastal flooding, coastal erosion, and tsunamis. And coastal flooding and coastal erosion were previously profiled under flood-related hazards, and in this update, they are profiled separately. Rising temperatures affects extreme temperatures and wildfires. Both of those hazards were profiled as such in the 2015 update, but new to this update is the inclusion of invasive species. Now, those aren't always seen as a natural hazard, but it does keep the plan consistent with the 2018 state hazard mitigation and climate adaptation plan. Lastly, extreme weather included hazards such as hurricanes and tropical storms, severe winter storms, and tornadoes. And while the naming convention of those hazards was tweaked, including, for instance, severe winter storms versus winter storms, that didn't change significantly in this update. And then lastly, the non-climate influence hazard is earthquakes. Next slide, please. So a visual aspect of the risk assessment includes mapping activities. So the map on your screen here shows population density of the city of Revere. And this is at the census block level, which is the smallest unit of measurement used by the census. So the population density heat map really does a good job visualizing where the population lives, which helps identify where potential vulnerabilities are. So it does look like the highest concentration of residents is really in South Central Revere, as Aaron is demonstrating. And the green dots represent critical facilities as well in the city. Next slide, please. Another aspect that was critical to update the risk assessment was identifying land use as well. Now, land use does have some similarities with the population density map, as housing units are, one can assume, are correlated with population, but it also helps identify what some other potential vulnerable or important infrastructure is, such as educational facilities, industrial facilities, which might house hazardous materials, as well as tax-exempt property, which could be important in municipal assets. And similar to the previous map, critical facilities are also overlaid on the map. Next slide, please. The next map included the National Flood Insurance Rate Map, or the digital firm, and this was updated in 2017. So this was a new update into the 2021 update, and it visualizes the places in Revere that are most prone to flooding. And it also highlights where the critical facilities are in relation to flood-prone areas. Something that's interesting about this map is you can see there are critical facilities distributed across the municipality, but a healthy concentration is actually out of the flood zone, or the base flood zone. So that is a good sign, and it speaks well to the resilience of the city. And Next slide, please. And lastly, this map here demonstrates storm surge vulnerability, which is different than flooding. The storm surge vulnerability is assessed through the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration SLOSH maps, which stands for Sea, Lake, and Overland Surge from Hurricanes. And it demonstrates what the maximum possible extent of flooding is from hurricane categories 1 through 4. And while a category 4 hurricane is unlikely to strike Revere, you can see that much of the area of the land that would be inundated from a hurricane would be from category 1 hurricane. And the difference between category 1 inundation to a category 4 inundation is not very significant. And that red line on the middle of the map demonstrates and visualizes the path of the July 2014 tornado that struck Revere, which, while very rare, would have significant consequences if another one were to strike. Next slide, please. So the final slides of the risk assessment include a summary of impacts and vulnerability. And again, the hazards are profiled through the context of climate change. So inland flooding really presents possible damages to buildings and infrastructure. And the vulnerability was mapped on several of the slides previously shown, including the SLOSH and the FEMA flood zones. So low-lying areas, land in the special flood hazard area or FEMA flood zone, west and north Revere, and the Sales Creek area are most prone to inland flooding. Now, drought would mostly impact agricultural production and water access. So those most vulnerable to drought are residents on private water supply, which is not a significant concern to the city of Revere. Landslides present potential damages to buildings and infrastructure, and the entire city is vulnerable to landslides, even if they aren't very likely to happen. Similar to inland flooding, coastal flooding potentially damages buildings and infrastructure, and similar to inland flooding, low-lying coastal areas are most vulnerable, as well as several neighborhoods in the city, including Beachmont, the Point of Pines and Riverside's neighborhood, Oak Island, and Revere Beach. And coastal erosion and tsunamis both present the most vulnerability to residents adjacent to the coastline, and both hazards primarily threaten buildings and infrastructure. Next slide, please. And continued is the summary of impacts and vulnerability through rising temperatures and extreme weather. So extreme temperatures affect or can possibly threaten public health, access to lifeline utilities such as electricity and potable water in the event of a energy disruption. And the entire city is vulnerable to extreme temperatures, but an emphasis is placed on the marginalized communities or the most vulnerable communities, such as low income and elderly residents who may not have access to a vehicle to get out of harm's way. Wildfires also can potentially damage buildings. And as identified in previous plans, the residents most adjacent to shrubland and the MBTA lands are most vulnerable to wildfires. Now, invasive species is a new hazard, and these impacts rarely affect humans directly, although there are several public health concerns associated with invasive species, or Lyme disease is one potential concern. And as such, the entire city is vulnerable to invasive species. And for extreme weather, that includes hurricanes and tropical storms, which threaten buildings and infrastructure. And while the entire city is vulnerable, those adjacent to the coast and in low-lying coastal areas are most vulnerable. Severe winter storms, those are most common, most likely. Those do affect the entire city, but there is an emphasis on low-income and elderly residents who might be most vulnerable to those storms. And tornadoes Like many of the hazards previously described, do threaten buildings and infrastructure, and the entire city is vulnerable. And the same goes to earthquakes. They threaten damages to buildings and infrastructure, and the entire city is vulnerable. So that concludes the summary of the risk assessment, impacts, and vulnerability. So with that, I can turn it back to Aaron to discuss the mitigation strategy.
Thanks a lot, Tom. I know that was a lot of information for people to kind of absorb, and there will be a chance for discussion and questions. So if you did see anything that piqued your interest or that you wanted to hear more about, there should be some time to go back and talk about that. But as Tom mentioned, now we wanted to spend some time, all this risk assessment that was done, understanding the city's vulnerabilities, what's exposed. It's really kind of feeding into the hazard mitigation strategy for the city. And it's framed around these mitigation goals that you see on the screen. These were developed through a review of what was previously included in the 2015 update. A lot of these are very similar. There were some minor changes to them. But again, one at the top, goal, ensure that critical infrastructure sites are protected. Also protect existing residential and business areas from flooding. Maximize, make efficient use of public funds. Continue and enforce the building and zoning regulations to help build wisely in the future. Educate the public about various issues that can help. Encourage future development in areas that are best suited for it and not vulnerable. Again, education, outreach, and then protecting the city's availability to respond to the various natural hazard events when they happen. So those are kind of the 8 goals from which then a variety of actions were developed and identified as far as what can be done to help achieve or make progress toward those goals. So we came up with, I think, a really nice mix of options ranging from more of a nature-based approach to mitigation measures, to some structural measures, to some social and public health related issues. And I think you'll see those on the next few slides. Also worth noting that the source of these actions came from a few different areas. Tom mentioned earlier the city's participation in the municipal vulnerability preparedness effort that the state, the Commonwealth, has rolled out. We supported an earlier effort for that, and through that, some great actions and priorities came out of that planning process, which were folded directly into this update. There was no need to redo the work that was done there. Some great actions were identified, so those were folded over into the city's current update. So a few of those, I'll touch on a few on the slide. Conduct a citywide drainage study, understanding that there's certain condition capacity issues that the city would like to be able to address and resolve. Kind of working on establishing a greater connection and contacts to the state to identify and kind of make sure that you can have access to the funds you need, and kind of increase that line of communication. And then there's a few others here identified. Again, some linkage, water's a common theme here. Sometimes there's too much of it. So again, improving the drainage system based on that study, kind of a follow-up action. And a couple more that got carried over from the MVP planning process. Again, public outreach and education is very important to reach those that are most affected. And then understanding that there's a diverse population in Revere, making sure that the resources that are available can be used by the different population groups, including those that are potentially vulnerable population groups. Then this slide starts the list of additional items and actions that were identified through the meetings that we've had with the city's local hazard mitigation planning committee, as well as the earlier stakeholder meeting that we had this year. Some of those include upgrading Point of Pines pump station and the pump that's located there, working on, again, some drainage issues, adding a new outfall. This heat effect issue can help be, it can be helped by tree canopy. So looking at more vegetation, especially in areas that have a lot of impervious surface and cover, trying to increase the overall canopy in the city. Some marsh restoration efforts. These are great absorption areas for those coastal hazards and taking care of them. and improving them is very important. The city's had success with that in the past and wants to do more of that. Beach nourishment issues, restoration, and then also, tying in hazard mitigation when there's capital improvement projects happening, making sure that this connection is being made to the needs in the city. A few others, drainage improvements, again, some roadway related issues. There was a great riverfront master plan that was conducted for a portion and project site in the Riverside area, Point of Pines area. And I think that's going to be moving forward with looking into some stormwater management efforts. And then also out of the MVP action grant that was recently completed, there were some next steps identified for coastal resilience in the Point of Pines Riverside area. And then also just helping out with their emergency response, getting some high water fire trucks so they can access the high water areas. And then linked to we had the pump station before. This is looking at more on the wastewater side. Then a couple more here that were identified. There's some renewed interest in energy with a project that's been looked at for a long time. It's more regional in nature rather than just Revere, but Revere can do its part by advocating for it. And this is the Army Corps' Regional Flood Protection Project that's looking to help out both Revere, Saugus, Malden, other communities. And it's a very large and important effort. So the city of Revere is definitely a champion for that. And then it was also identified there was a seawall that was potentially needing some improvements and reinforcements. But all in all, I didn't cover all of them, but there's a total of 48 actions that are included in the 2021 update. Each of them has kind of a ballpark cost, which departments are going to be responsible for tracking and implementing them. And that's all included in the review or the version of the plan that's available for review. So I encourage you, if you're interested to find out more, to go to the action section and you can find out all those details.
I also just want to point out that the city of Revere was also awarded a grant to begin a regional working group between Revere, Lynn, Malden, Everett, and Saugus to begin discussions on the Pines River and Saugus River watershed for flood protection as well. So those conversations will be starting in the next few weeks. So with that said, Aaron, thank you so much for running us through that. As Aaron mentioned, the plan is obviously much longer than this 27-page presentation, and it is available for everyone's consumption on the website. If anybody is having any trouble reaching it or accessing it, please feel free to reach out to me at ebaker@revere.org. If you have any questions or comments, you can also send those my way. And again, we'll be accepting feedback until October 15th. And again, I thank all of you for being here tonight. And I'd like to open it up if anybody has any comments or questions or anything you would like to expand upon for all of those that are here on the call.
Yeah, I'd like to state one thing that having been involved in the 2005 and 2015 update for the hazard mitigation plan for the city, there's been one difference that I see, and that is now climate change, and particularly sea level rise, which has now been put at the forefront of all the discussions we've had, and kind of impose a sense of urgency for a lot of these projects we're talking about with the that are being prioritized as part of the hazard mitigation plan. Back in 2005, 2015, there was discussion of sea level rise, but the data wasn't as significant that is available now that really brought it to light. So it wasn't taken as seriously as it is now, and it's as a result of that, I think the city is now moving forward in a more positive mindset of urgency to get these projects completed with the help of the state and federal government.
I would agree.
Yeah. I just want to thank Elle for spearheading the effort. She kept us all on track, and it was a good process, and happy to see it end.
Thank you. It's been a long process. I think we started meeting over a year ago, but I think we've collected a lot of great data, and we've had a lot of great interactions with the stakeholders as well through both the Riverfront Master Plan, the MVP process, which has been folded into the hazard mitigation planning, as well as a lot of the efforts that we've taken hold of with the resiliency study for MVP in Point of Pines and Riverside area. So we definitely want to dig a little deeper throughout the other vulnerable areas in the city, and the MVP planning process has really been able to enable us to move projects forward. So as Aaron mentioned, there were some projects identified in the feasibility study that we've already gone out for funding to MVP and been awarded funding to move those projects forward to planning stages. So with that said, I also want to give a shout out to Don Chamella. He's been instrumental, as well as Frank and Joe Maglione, as well as Steve that is also on the call. Thank you all for all of your feedback and all of your efforts along the way and sharing information. We also have Jack Macari on the phone as well from the Point of Pines Beach Association, who was also heavily involved with the feasibility study for Point of Pines and Riverside. So thank you to all of you. Does anybody else have any last comments or anything you'd like to share?
Yeah, I do briefly.
Hi, Jack. Thank you.
Hey, thanks for all the work you folks have done. You know, as I'd like something to be able to show to the Beach Association Board of Directors. Now, I've been along for the ride and looked at all your documents, but and you referred to a website and the but you know, as I look at the document, it's not really accessible to people that aren't willing to put hours into it. It's, you know, okay, introduction, how we assess the risk. It's the hows and whys, but nothing says this is the actual plan. The mitigation actions was the best thing that I could show people. And I'd love to see all 48 actions. That's sort of to me, a condensed, I need a condensed version to be able to interact with, you know, the membership and especially the board. I guess that's it.
Thank you for that feedback. We can see what we can do to pull out those elements of the report and make it into a more accessible summary.
Thanks.
That's a good point.
Yeah,
Thank you for that.
Just to add to that, as far as excerpting or having something that's more readily shared, or the so what takeaways, there is a hazard mitigation strategy. There's also some loud motorcyclists outside my house too. Sorry about that. But there's a section that does really frame it, the goals, the actions. So yes, I think between the city and us, we can get you something.
Absolutely. Thanks. That's a great comment, John.
Thanks, guys. Thanks, everybody.
Steve had a comment in the chat, maybe an executive summary to reflect the FEMA requirements. Great point. Thank you. Okay.
Yeah, no problem.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Thank you.
yeah, no problem. I know that there's a format to what FEMA requires,
Right.
because that's how you get your funding. But the point is to John's Jack requirement or comment was that just boil it down a bit somehow. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you all for joining us. I'm going to give it one more minute, one more moment. If anyone has any last comments. And with that, I'd really just like to thank everyone for their participation. There are a lot of people that are involved that are not on the call this evening, but definitely had a lot of input and feedback to the planning process throughout many of the different strategies that we've had for mitigation planning. So with this report, we're looking forward to moving things forward and going after some additional grant funding and capital planning funds to reinforce our mitigation plans. So thank you to AECom for being our fearless leaders through this process. We really appreciate it and hope everyone has a great night. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Night.